Thanks everyone for joining today's webinar on occupational environmental pesticide exposure. We'll be focusing on 3 commonly used pesticides in Canada: chlorothalonil, glyphosate, and 2,4-D. Before we get started, I just wanted to run through some housekeeping items. So this video will be, or this presentation will be recorded and posted on our website, but we will be excluding the discussion and no names will be included in that recording. You have been muted upon entry, but if you have any questions or comments, please do enter them at the chat box at the bottom of the screen, and we will be answering questions at the end of the presentation. My name is Ella Ridds, and I'm one of the presenters for today, and I'm based out of Toronto, which is situated on the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and we're very grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. I'm joined today by Dr. Christian Larson. He is a research scientist with CAREX Canada. He's also a sessional lecturer at the University of Toronto and an adjunct professor at Ryerson University. He has a master's in health geography, PhD in planning, and postdoc in epidemiology. He works on various environmental health-related research projects, including environmental exposures to carcinogens, the built environment and physical activity, children's mobility, air pollution and asthma, adolescent health and addiction, pedestrian injuries, and healthcare accessibility. And as for myself, I'm a senior research associate at CAREX Canada, and I have a master's of public health in environmental and occupational health from the University of Alberta. My research interests lie in occupational exposure assessment, the impacts of sex and gender on health, and the mobilization of occupational exposure and cancer research through accessible tools, materials, and collaborations. I'm also joined by Dr. Cheryl Peters. She's the co-PI of CAREX Canada, and she'll be facilitating the question period at the end of the presentation. Okay, so just an overview of today's presentation. We'll start off by talking a bit about pesticide sales in Canada. Then we'll explore how substances are assessed for their carcinogenicity. And we'll talk about some of the health impacts that are associated with the 3 pesticides of interest. We'll go into a bit of detail about our occupational and environmental exposure estimates. And then we'll finish off with a discussion in which we will welcome questions from the audience. So pesticides are formulations that are used to control, destroy, or inhibit the activities of pests and to minimize their injurious, noxious, or troublesome effects. Pesticides are made up of a whole bunch of different substances, including surfactants, emulsifiers, solvents, water, and also active ingredients. And these describe the specific chemicals that are responsible for the pesticide's action. For example, glyphosate, 2,4-D, chlorothalonil, these are the active ingredients. And active ingredients are regulated by the Pest Management Regulatory Agency, also known as PMRA, which is part of Health Canada. The PMRA evaluates active ingredients on 15-year cycles to assess their environmental and human health impacts. There are 7,500 products registered for use in Canada and approximately 650 different active ingredients. The data we have here are from the PMRA, and it shows trends in pesticide sales in Canada in kilograms of active ingredients from 2008 to 2018. On the vertical axis, the y-axis, we have kilograms of active ingredients, and then year on the x-axis. And what we can see is that there's some variations in pesticide sales across the years, but overall we're seeing an increasing trend. And this is primarily driven by agricultural sales. In 2018, approximately 70% of total pesticide sales in Canada were for the agricultural sector. There are, of course, other uses for pesticides within Canada. So we see the domestic proportion is quite small relative to the total sales. And we also have some pesticides meant for non-agricultural use, and this is primarily for wood preservation and water treatment. On this slide, we have pesticide sales by type of pesticide and sector for 2018. And I kind of just wanted to show you this to show how the breakdown by sector is quite different. So within the agricultural sector, most pesticide sales are for herbicides and fungicides. Whereas within non-agricultural sector, it's mostly antimicrobials. And then again, with the domestic side of things, we're seeing a mix of antimicrobials and herbicides with some insecticides in there. There are many different uses of pesticides within agriculture specifically. The most commonly known one is, of course, that they kill, control, and repel pests, but they're also used to regulate plant growth, stabilize nitrogen levels, and also to desiccate crops. So for this last one, some pesticides are applied to crops prior to harvesting, and it helps desiccate the crops at a more even level, and it aids in the harvesting of it. And these uses yield many benefits that are important. So of course, increased crop productivity, reduced labor requirements, and enhanced produce aesthetics, which are valued within our society. And so who are we and why do we care? We're CAREX Canada. CAREX stands for carcinogen exposure. And we're a multi-institution team of researchers and specialists with expertise in a variety of fields, including occupational hygiene, risk assessment, toxicology, geographic information systems, and knowledge mobilization. And what we do is we try to identify what carcinogens Canadians are exposed to within the work and in the community. We want to know where in Canada these exposures occur, how many people are exposed, and to what extent. And really our vision, our end goal is to inform efforts to reduce Canadians' exposures to known and suspected carcinogens. Nearly half of people will get cancer in their lifetime, and identifying carcinogens or like areas in which we can reduce exposures to not known carcinogens can help prevent some of these cancers. In 2015, pesticides were determined a priority by CAREX Canada, and this was due to a number of reasons. So first was that pesticides are very highly used within Canada, as I showed with the PMRA data. Also because there's high public interest in pesticides, and finally because the International Agency for Research on Cancer was planning on evaluating a number of pesticides in the coming years for their carcinogenicity. So the International Agency for Research on Cancer, or IARC, is part of the World Health Organization, and they conduct hazard assessments to see if a substance can cause cancer. And they look to publicly available peer-reviewed data. I do want to emphasize here that the IARC classification does not measure the likelihood that a cancer will occur at a specific exposure level. This would be called risk, but rather IARC classifications highlight the potential to be carcinogenic. And so hazard assessments, they help us understand how the features of a pesticide can cause cancer and other harmful effects. IARC considers human, animal, and mechanistic data when classifying substances, and they categorize substances into a few different categories. So group 1, definite carcinogens, group 2A, probable carcinogens, group 2B, possible, and 3 is non-classifiable. On this slide, I show a matrix of how IARC might consider or does consider different types of evidence when classifying a substance. So they use a strength of evidence approach. They evaluate how strong the evidence is and use that to classify the substance. So for example, if a substance had limited human evidence, but sufficient animal data, that substance might be would be classified as a group 2A probable carcinogen. Important to note is that IARC does also consider mechanistic data, and that has the possibility of moving a substance from one group to another. So for example, if we had limited human data and limited animal data, but very strong mechanistic data, that substance might be bumped up to a group 2A. And as of 2021, IARC had reviewed a good number of pesticides. But you'll notice that most of them are considered probable and possible carcinogens here. And this kind of just speaks to the strength of evidence approach in that currently their strength of evidence is not that strong. Some of the studies, there's just inadequate human evidence, usually due to small sample size, inadequate exposure assessment, and other limitations. We decided to focus on glyphosate, 2,4-D, and chlorothalonil for our research because these are the pesticides with the highest sales in Canada that have been classified by IARC. So glyphosate is very commonly known. It was introduced in the 70s, but really took off in the 90s and 2000s with the invention of glyphosate-tolerant crops. And in 2017, greater than 50 million kilograms of active ingredients were sold in Canada. And unfortunately, we don't have precise numbers here. These data are from the PMRA, and the data is a bit aggregate like this, so we don't have a better sense of what that value is. IARC classified glyphosate as a group 2A carcinogen on the basis of limited human evidence of non-Hodgkin's lymphoma and sufficient animal data. 2,4-D is another commonly used herbicide. Within Canada, 1 to 5 million kilograms of active ingredients were sold in 2017. And IARC classified 2,4-D as a group 2B carcinogen. And this is on the basis of inadequate human evidence of non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, limited animal data, and strong mechanistic data. And finally, we have chlorothalonil. Chlorothalonil is the second most commonly sold fungicide in Canada. The first is mancozeb, which hadn't been evaluated by IARC, which is why we chose to look at chlorothalonil. In Canada in 2017, 1 to 5 million kilograms of active ingredients were sold. And it also was classified as a group 2B carcinogen on the basis of strong animal evidence. There are other health effects that have been observed between glyphosate, 2,4-D. Within chlorothalonil, actually, most of the studies have focused on cancer, which is kind of interesting to see. But I'll let you read through the slide and see what some of the associations are. However, I want to emphasize that additional studies are needed to better understand these associations. Many of these studies did not account for co-exposures, or there may have been just 1 or 2 studies that detected an association. And so additional research is very much needed to understand if what we are seeing is true. And this brings us to our research question. So what we wanted to know is how many workers in the agricultural industry are exposed to chlorothalonil, glyphosate, and 2,4-D, and how likely they are to be exposed. And then on the environmental side, we wanted to know how many community members are potentially exposed to chlorothalonil, glyphosate, and 2,4-D due to agricultural pesticide use. And we decided to focus on the agricultural side of things because of the vast sales that occur for the agricultural sector, but also because of data availability and that we thought we would be able to create the best estimates for the agricultural sector specifically. For our general approach, we first developed a pesticides advisory committee to help guide the method development. We then reviewed available data and tools in Canada and abroad to see what has been done previously, how we can build off of that work, and how different pieces of data have been used. And then finally, we finalized methods and applied them to select pesticides to demonstrate the feasibility and outcomes. This slide shows who was part of our pesticides advisory committee. And they include experts in cancer epidemiology, exposure assessment, occupational epidemiology, and geographic information systems. And we would meet with these individuals. We met with them 4 times over 1 year to discuss the methods, how we're incorporating different pieces of data, and to talk about our assumptions and what the impacts of those would be. And ultimately with their assistance, we're able to come up with some methods that we'll be discussing today. In terms of available data and tools, we found that good quality pesticide use or sales data in Canada are lacking. In terms of national data, the PMRA has the best data, but as you had seen, it's quite aggregate and so has limited use. Some provinces and territories do collect pesticide use or sales data, but it's inconsistent in that some provinces collect use data, others sales. They're not collected every year, and they might collect the data for specific sectors. And so it's hard to get an idea of exposure across Canada using that data. Data on agricultural workers' operations, tasks, and crops worked are also not available within Canada. Most of the data are from the Census of Agriculture, which are at the farm type level. So it's still a bit high level. There is available data from the United States on some of these, however, that we did draw from. And then finally, we found that some population level estimates of environmental and occupational pesticide exposure exist. So there are a few other CAREX systems in other countries that had looked at pesticides exposure, and these include Costa Rica, Nicaragua, and Panama. And so we looked at these to see what they had done and how, if we could use a similar approach. Okay, so now we're going to get into the occupational exposure estimates in a bit more detail. And yeah, we were looking at the agricultural sector or industry in particular. And so some of the workers that we're interested in are, of course, farmers, farm managers, the workers, harvesters, and also workers like landscapers and horticulturalists. The sources of exposure that we were looking at in particular were pesticide mixing, loading, and applying, storage and cleanup, and also exposure upon re-entry to areas that had already been treated. We didn't really consider aerial drift based on limited data availability. We just weren't able to look at that. And of course, the routes of exposure for these sources of exposure are skin contact and inhalation. To create our estimates, we first established the number of agricultural workers by farm type. So we looked at two data sources in particular from 2016. The first was the Census of Agriculture, which captures all farm operators and paid agricultural workers in Canada. And data are available by farm type. So we were able to request the data and use it directly from the Census of Ag. We also pulled data from the Census of Population. And the reason we did this was that most of our other estimates are based on the Census of Population, and we wanted to see what the values would look like there. However, the Census of Population asks for individuals' main job, and so it likely does not include seasonal, temporary, part-time, or migrant workers who might not consider this their main job. And for the Census of Population, data were available for farms overall, and so we had to parse out these workers into specific farm types. The way we did this was by applying the relative proportion of workers across farm types from the Census of Agriculture to the labor force data from the Census of Population. In the next step, we estimated the number of workers who are at risk of exposure. And we pulled from two data sources in order to do this. First were pesticide labels, which are legal documents that identify which pesticides are registered for use on which crops. The second data source is, again, the Census of Agriculture, where we pulled data on the percentage of farms applying herbicides or fungicides by farm type. To combine these two data sources, we made a couple of assumptions. First is that farm types only grow the crop that they describe. For example, that wheat farms only grow wheat. The second assumption is that if the pesticide is registered for use on a specific crop, it is indeed applied. And so by making these two assumptions, we're able to apply the percentage of farms applying herbicides or fungicides by farm type to the number of agricultural workers by farm type in order to get at the number of workers who are at risk of exposure. In the third step, we assigned likelihood of exposure. Workers were assigned to mutually exclusive groups, and we did this by using US task data. So from the US National Agricultural Workers Survey, we were able to get the main tasks performed by agricultural workers by crop type. And we applied this data to our numbers from step 2. And we classified workers as exposed if they mixed, loaded, or applied pesticides. We considered them probably exposed if their primary task could lead to dermal contact with treated crops, for example, through reentry. And then finally, all other workers were considered possibly exposed. So if the workers were identified as at risk of exposure, but were not considered exposed or probably exposed, we slotted them into the possibly exposed category. And finally, we assessed exposure among agricultural workers with missing information. So one thing I didn't mention before is that the Census of Agriculture does exclude some workers, for example, contractors. And then there were some additional workers that we were interested in assessing their exposure for within the agricultural industry as well. And so we used the CAREX approach to fill in these gaps, which means we identified the missing occupations and industries of interest that would have exposure, and then we assigned a proportion of workers exposed using available data or drawing upon agricultural extension agents and using our own expert assessments. This slide shows our overall results for the number of workers exposed and the percentage of workers exposed. So the lower estimates, these are the ones that are based on the Census of Population. The upper estimates are based on the Census of Agriculture. And what we can see here is that the number and percentage of workers exposed, they follow general trends in sales as well. So the highest number of workers exposed are to glyphosate, which had the highest sales, followed by 2,4-D and by chlorothalonil. There is a big jump between the lower and upper estimates. And again, this is due to the two different data sources capturing slightly different populations. And so the upper estimates likely capture some of those seasonal, temporary, part-time workers that are important to consider because they might be at higher risk of exposure for other reasons, such as due to precarious work or maybe lack of training, language barriers. So just an interesting area that might warrant further exploration. The percentage of workers exposed fell within what we expected. So as I had mentioned before, there are 3 other CAREX systems that assess occupational exposure to pesticides. And for 2 of them, the values range from 0.3 to 13% of workers being exposed to pesticides within those countries. That was for Costa Rica and Nicaragua. However, for Panama, our values are much higher compared to that country, where 0.3 to 4% of workers were considered exposed. But we were expecting variations because our research focuses on the agricultural sector in specific, whereas the other CAREX systems looked at all workers. And also because we grow different crops and we have different practices. So some variations were expected, but it was nice to see that our estimates fell within reason. This slide shows the top 5 industries by pesticide, and you can find these figures on our website too. The figures show the upper range. So these are the exposure estimates based on the Census of Agriculture. And what we're seeing is that the estimates very much reflect pesticide registration. So for example, glyphosate and 2,4-D, the largest farm types are those for which 2,4-D and glyphosate are registered, whereas for chlorothalonil, the top farm type is fruit and tree nut farming. One thing I did want to point out here is that you might see some similarities across the different figures. So for example, the number and percent of workers exposed within other grain farming to glyphosate and 2,4-D are the same. And this is a reflection of some of the assumptions that we made, that if a pesticide is registered for use on the crop, then it is indeed applied, and then that we are using that percentage of farms applying herbicides for both glyphosate and 2,4-D. So that's a limitation of our methods that can be refined as more data becomes available on pesticide use by crop. The results by province. So on the y-axis, we have the percent of workers exposed, and then province on the x-axis. And here we'll see that the results do reflect the types of crops that are grown within the different provinces. So within the prairie provinces, we're seeing a high percent of workers exposed to glyphosate and 2,4-D, which are primarily used on field crops. And then interestingly for chlorothalonil, we're seeing quite a bit used in Prince Edward Island and New Brunswick, where there's actually quite a bit of potato grown, and chlorothalonil is commonly used to treat potato blights. And so I guess as a concluding slide for the occupational estimates, these are the first attempt at estimating population level occupational exposure to pesticides in Canada. We found that there are significant exposures to pesticides in Canada. The numbers are quite high, and the values that I was showing, those are the groups of workers that were classified as exposed, but we still have those probably and possibly exposed categories that need further exploration to better understand the exposure there. And there are potential exposures happening there, so it is warranted. As I mentioned, based on the difference between the census of population and census of agriculture estimates, it seems like a good chunk of workers that are exposed are those temporary, part-time, seasonal workers, and that they should not be overlooked, and that there's space for additional research within this group of workers. And finally, I want to emphasize that these estimates can be refined as more detailed Canadian data on pesticide use by crop and or farm and workers' tasks become available. We were pulling from whatever data is publicly available. And I was excited to hear that the PMRA is considering collecting more detailed data on pesticide use by crop that could help further refine these estimates. So that's something that we might be getting, is better data one day. And so, Christian, I'm going to pass it off to you.
Thank you, Ella. Okay, so I'm going to continue talking here, and I'm going to start with the environmental exposure estimate. So the purpose and objective of this part of the study was to generate national population level potential exposure estimates for Canada based on agricultural usage for the 3 identified commonly applied pesticides. So the objective is we were going to apply geographic information systems, or GIS, to base our approach to estimate potential exposure to the 3 pesticides. So again, we used publicly available data for this. So the 3 main sources of data that we used were the type of crops being grown in Canada and where they're being grown, crop-specific pesticide application rates, and then population data to understand the number of people that might be potentially exposed. So where do these come from? So I'm just going to break down the 3 different potential, the 3 different sources that we used. So crop type comes from Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada's annual crop inventory. We used 2016 data to correspond with the 2016 census as well. So this annual crop inventory is a raster-based surface, which is basically a picture that has a spatial reference to it. So I'm showing you in this kind of map the Niagara region, and you can see some of the different crops that are grown. And what we can do with this is we can pull out how many acres or how many square kilometers of crops are being grown in particular areas. The accuracy of the 2016 version was about 89%, so just about 90% accurate. And this is verified through provincial insurance companies and ministries. So 90% is or 89% is pretty accurate when we're thinking of what crops are being grown in what areas. So application rate. So this was the second one. So once we know where the crops are growing, then we have to know how much pesticide might be applied to them. So we did not have Canadian data on pesticide application rates. We used data from the US Department of Agricultural, their chemical use program. There were a few that we were able to get some data from Ontario Ministry of Agriculture and Rural Affairs. So for a few different crops, we were able to pull some data from that as well. But the majority did come from the US chemical use program. And then what these tell us is, based on a square kilometer of land, how many kilograms would be applied to that particular crop. And it varies by crop. So for wheat, you have a certain, for winter wheat, you have a certain application rate. For spring wheat, you have a certain application rate. For corn, you have a certain application rate, and every one of them is slightly different. So with once we identify the crops, we can then highlight, well, this is how much pesticide would be applied. The final data set that we needed was the population data. So we used the 2016 census of the population, and this is basically telling us, how many people are living in what area. We ended up creating this data with the oh, I think I just accidentally clicked the slide. Oh, we're back. Okay, with the by census subdivision. So census subdivision is a large enough unit that we can do analysis for at the national level, but a small enough spatial unit that you can actually get some variability within the data as well. And I'll show you guys what that looks like when we get to the maps themselves. But it's kind of the right balance of size of a spatial unit to do a national level estimate. If we tried to go any smaller, it would be very difficult to even run it. So that's the data, that's where it came from. Then how did we take those three data sets and actually create these estimates? So the approach is based on other GIS-based methods that have been used in the US, never at the national level. They've always been at different state levels or parts of the state where they've kind of determined potential pesticide exposure. So we isolate the crops. So I'm showing an example here where we isolate the crops. So I'm pulling out in this instance just winter wheat that's growing, and I just zoomed in on the Niagara area again just to kind of show in detail kind of what's happening. So we isolate all of the crops, and then we determine how many square kilometers of crops are grown in each census subdivision. So this gives us crop specific values that were summed to give us the total potential exposure. So once we determine, there's 42 square kilometers of winter wheat grown in this census subdivision, and it has an application rate of X, we can then multiply it to determine how many kilograms of pesticide were being applied. So I put the formula in here, but we don't have to really go over that, but that's kind of the details of it. So how does this work? Well, we look at the total amount of pesticide applied within each census subdivision. The results that we're showing here are the total kilograms of pesticide per square kilometer of agricultural land. So my example that I like to give is, so let's say if there's 14 kilograms of glyphosate were applied by census subdivision, and it had a total area of 10 square kilometers of agricultural land, the application rate would break down to 1.4 kilograms per square kilometer. So this application rate is a proxy for potential exposure. So we don't know if they're exposed, but we know that this is how much pesticide would be applied in this particular census subdivision. So that's a proxy for exposure. Population exposure was then compiled by quartiles so that we could look at the number of people living in each province. So once we've broken out the exposure quartile, we then break it into quartiles, and then we say, okay, well, this is the bottom quartile and the top quartile and the middle two quartiles, which would then give you a kind of a rough estimate of how many people are in each of those categories and how many people would be exposed in the environment. So what did the results say? So this is this map is 2,4-D, and this is showing it by census subdivision. So this is kind of the spatial unit that we use to demonstrate this data. So the darker red represents a higher application rate or a higher potential exposure. So 2,4-D exposure is much higher in areas where cereal crops and potatoes and fruit are more commonly grown due to the higher application rate. So, the prairie provinces, Prince Edward Island, Southern Quebec, all had higher potential exposure than many other places. And then how does this relate to the number of people that would be potentially exposed? Well, over 2 million people in Canada were living in the highest quartile exposure. So the highest, the top, 75 to 100%, that's how a quartile would be broken down. So that top quartile, we're having 2 million people living there. That only amounts to about 6% of the Canadian population, but it's still a pretty high number of people. So a couple of things just to note here is PEI had the highest proportion of its population in that high exposure quartile, but Quebec had the largest number of people. And this simply relates to the population in Quebec versus the population in PEI. So PEI had a large proportion, so the lots of people that live in PEI were in that highest exposure category. But overall, it's a smaller number of people simply because in PEI, there's only 142, almost 143,000 people, and we had almost 70,000. So, almost half of them in that high exposure category, where for somewhere like Quebec, you have over 8 million people. They had 1.3 million in that high exposure category. So what about glyphosate? So looking at glyphosate exposure, what we're seeing is areas where crops such as canola, wheat, corn, and soybeans are more commonly grown. We're getting the higher exposures. So again, the prairie provinces, Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, parts of Southern Quebec, again, all had that higher potential exposure. And the darker red is representing the higher potential exposure to glyphosate. So fairly similar in the sense of the number of people. Once again, we're kind of over 2 million people are living in areas with the highest exposure quartile. But what we're seeing here is, again, Quebec has a high number of people exposed, but Manitoba and Saskatchewan actually had a high percentage of their population, 85 and 76%, respectively, living above the median. So in these top two categories, above the median values, we're seeing a very high exposure. But most of that exposure for Manitoba and for Saskatchewan is in the third quartile. So not the highest exposure, but still above average. So it's interesting to kind of highlight. And what did we find for chlorothalonil? This one actually is a fairly different map from the other ones. This shows a little different, and that just relates again to the application rates of chlorothalonil and the crop types it's used on. So chlorothalonil exposure is much higher in areas where root crops such as potatoes along with fruits are more commonly grown, and that's what you start to see. So southern British Columbia, with the fruit farming, you start to see a lot more exposure. Prince Edward Island, again, parts of southern Quebec and some of the prairies also had higher potential exposure to chlorothalonil. So what does this kind of break down to the number of people? So again, the highest category here. So we're at about 1.5 million people, so 5% of the population. So a little lower. But we see in this one, British Columbia had the highest number of people in this instance, where they had 1.19 million people in that highest exposure category. And again, Prince Edward Island had the highest percentage or proportion of their population living in the high exposure. So for PEI, again, there's only 89,000 people exposed, but out of the 142 or 143,000 people living there, that's 63% of their population is in that highest potential exposure category. So just a couple of summary slides here to kind of wrap things up. Pesticide exposure estimates are a methodological issue for epidemiology studies. Examining pesticides in health, there's a lack of real data out there on potential exposure. The issue is exposure typically comes from self-report, examining concentrations in water, soil, or air, could be biomonitoring. Well, these are great ways to get pesticide exposure data. They are somewhat invasive, depending on the approach that's taken. They are expensive, and they're also difficult to translate from an individual to the population level. So what we did is we used GIS to get a better understanding of kind of population level estimates. So we, like I said, we use GIS to understand how agricultural activity may relate to environmental pesticide exposures. And this study really adds to the previous work that's been done by showing how estimates of pesticide exposure from agriculture may vary based on where you live and the crops that are grown in those particular areas. So there are some limitations associated with this approach, obviously. We are only measuring application rates. Actual exposure is not known. Actual usage is also not known. So some farms may use more or less. We used average values. Some might not use any, some might use more. Another thing to mention here is the methods focus on potential exposure in the environment, but these estimates don't account for dietary ingestion as well, which is an important route of exposure for pesticides. And then due to the number of people potentially exposed, could be over or underestimated because we don't know where the people are living within that census subdivision either. We're just telling these are the number of people that might be farther away from that farms and not exposed to that degree. So there definitely are some limitations to think about here as well. So overall conclusion, there's thousands of millions of kilograms of active ingredients sold each year in Canada. Most of them are for agricultural use. Remember, over 70% were for agricultural use. IARC has classified glyphosate as a probable carcinogen and 2,4-D and chlorothalonil as possible carcinogens. Associations between glyphosate and 2,4-D and other health effects have been found, but more research is really required to understand kind of the true effects of these pesticides. While we estimated exposure to pesticides among agricultural workers, we found that significant numbers were exposed to these three pesticides. While environmental estimates focus on national and provincial scales, we could do kind of more detailed analysis for certain areas. So I mentioned that we focus on census subdivisions because that's what we could do at the national level. But if we wanted to look at something more locally, we could redo these methods with a smaller spatial scale to get a little bit more variability. Pesticide application rates do not translate directly to exposure, but it does provide a population level estimate and it identifies areas of concerns. So we have some next steps here that we can share these estimates more broadly, which is part of what we're doing here today. And we can apply these estimates to other pesticides as well, or other areas as well, looking at kind of more fine-tuned analysis. So this study wouldn't happen without our study team or pesticides advisory committee. And then we also wanted to notify that CAREX Canada is funded by the Canadian Partnership Against Cancer. So they funded this project as well. And if you want some more details on these studies, both of these studies, the environmental and the occupational study, have been published. So there's links here as well to the journal articles. If you wanted some more details on the methods and those types of things, they are out there for you as well. And here's just a connect with us. So if you have any questions, the Twitter or email is on there for us. And if you want to see more details on these pesticide estimates as well, all of this stuff is loaded onto our CAREX Canada website. So you can look at the maps are on there, the occupational estimates are on there, all that stuff is all loaded up.
Thanks, Christian. And that concludes our webinar on CAREX Canada's occupational and environmental pesticides. Thanks to everyone for joining. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to reach out to us.